I was resent with my mother because she continues to spoil my brother, who is 28 years old and still depends on her. I feel like the villain in my own family because I've grown to resent my mom for the way she enables my older brother. To put it bluntly, he has never had his life together. He dropped out of college after 2 years because it wasn't for him. And since then, he's bounced between part-time jobs and passion projects that never go anywhere. My mom, bless her heart, thinks he's just a late bloomer and continues to baby him. She pays for his rent, his car maintenance, his groceries, and even random cheap or luxury things he needs to clear his mind. Meanwhile, I've been working part-time since I was 16, put myself through school with scholarships and loans, and now I have a steady job. But none of that seems to matter when it comes to the way my mom divides her attention and resources. Whenever I try to bring up how unfair it is, my mom tells me he's going through a lot, or he just needs some time. I can't even count how many times I've heard, "You don't understand, he's your brother. Family helps family." She says it so often that it's practically her mantra now, and I'm tired of hearing it. But it feels like I'm being punished for being responsible. I still live at home to save money while I pay off my student loans, and I have to chip in for groceries and utilities. Yet my mom has never once asked my brother to contribute a cent, even when he was living at home last year. She'd cook for him, clean his room, and even do his laundry, while I had to handle everything on my own. It's reached the point where I avoid being around them together because I feel this bubbling anger whenever I see how much she coddles him. And when I do try to talk about my feelings, she either gets defensive or guilt trips me by saying things like, "I just wish you'd be more understanding of how hard his life has been." It's infuriating because I've had my own struggles too, but apparently those don't count. A few days ago, my mom told me she's taking out a loan to help him start his own business, which, let's be real, will probably flop like his other ideas. I snapped and said, maybe if you stop treating him like a child, he'd finally grow up. She started crying and told me I was being mean and ungrateful for all she does for both of us. Now I feel awful for making her cry, but I also feel like I'm at my breaking point. What makes it worse is that my brother seems completely oblivious to all of this. He walks around the house with this carefree attitude, like the world owes him something. I've overheard him telling his friends how lucky he is to have such a supportive mom, but he never acknowledges the sacrifices she's made for him or the toll it's taken on me. It's like he lives in a bubble where he's the center of the universe, and everyone else exists to keep him comfortable. Last month, I suggested to my mom that maybe my brother should see a therapist or a career counselor, someone who could help him figure out what he wants to do with his life. She dismissed the idea immediately, saying, he just needs more time to find his path. He's not ready for that kind of pressure. Pressure? He's 30 years old. At what point does it stop being pressure and start being reality? Meanwhile, I'm burning myself out trying to juggle work, paying off my loans, and saving for the future. I've started to question whether I'll ever be able to afford to move out, especially with the way rents have skyrocketed. And yet, my mom doesn't seem to see the irony in helping my brother with his rent while I'm stuck living paycheck to paycheck. The resentment has started to seep into other parts of my life. I find myself snapping at friends when they complain about their own families, thinking, you don't even know what it's like. I've started avoiding family gatherings because I can't stand the way my mom beams with pride whenever my brother talks about his latest project. And worst of all, I've caught myself wishing he would fail spectacularly, just so she'd finally see what I've been saying all along. But then I feel guilty because deep down, I don't actually want him to fail. He's my brother, and I do love him. I just wish he'd take some responsibility for his life instead of expecting everyone else to pick up the pieces. And I wish my mom could see how much her actions are hurting me, even if she doesn't mean to. The other day, I came home from work to find my mom and brother laughing in the kitchen. She was making his favorite meal, and he was telling her about some awesome new idea he'd had for a tech startup. I stood there in the doorway, watching them, and felt this wave of sadness wash over me. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a deep, aching sadness that things might never change. That night, I lay in bed thinking about all the times my mom had been there for me growing up. She worked long hours to make sure we had everything we needed, and she'd always been my biggest cheerleader. I know she loves me, and I know she's trying her best, but I can't help feeling like she's blind to the damage she's doing by enabling my brother. I've started researching apartments, even though I'm not sure I can afford to move out yet. Part of me feels like leaving is the only way to get some peace. But another part of me worries about what will happen if I'm not there to keep things balanced. Will my brother take advantage of her even more? Will she end up in debt because of him? The thought makes me sick to my stomach. A few nights ago, I decided to write my mom a letter. I poured out everything I've been feeling, the resentment, the anger, the sadness. I told her how much I love her and how much I appreciate everything she's done for us. But I also told her that I can't keep pretending everything is okay. I haven't given her the letter yet because I'm scared of how she'll react. But I think it's the only way to get through to her. I don't know what the future holds for our family. Maybe things will get better, or maybe they won't. But for now, all I can do is try to focus on my own life and hope that, someday, my mom and brother will see things from my perspective. Until then, I'll keep trying to find a way to navigate this complicated, messy thing we call family. After the confrontation with my mom and the writing of the letter I still couldn't bring myself to deliver, life at home became more stifling than ever. Every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope. My mom seemed more subdued, as though she sensed the tension but wasn't ready to address it. My brother, as usual, was oblivious, filling the house with his grandiose plans for the business my mom's loan was supposed to fund. Listening to him talk about it made me want to scream. One evening, I came home late from work, hoping to avoid both of them. As I slipped into the kitchen to grab something to eat, I overheard my mom and brother talking in the living room. She sounded exhausted but was still trying to reassure him. "It'll all work out," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "You just have to stay positive." I couldn't help but peek in, only to see her massaging her temples while he lounged on the couch, scrolling on his phone. It hit me then just how much this dynamic was wearing her down too, even if she refused to admit it. Instead of retreating to my room, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The night was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside the house. As I sat on the porch steps, I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. Was I being selfish for wanting things to change? Was it wrong to feel so resentful toward my own family? The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the anger. It felt like I was stuck in a cycle I couldn't break free from. The next day, I decided to reach out to my aunt, my mom's sister, who'd always been more practical and no nonsense. We weren't particularly close, but I remembered her saying once that I could come to her if I ever needed someone to talk to. I called her during my lunch break, nervously fumbling over my words as I explained the situation. To my surprise, she listened patiently without interrupting. When I finished, she let out a heavy sigh. "Your mom's always been like this with him," she said matter-of-factly. "Even when you were kids, she'd bend over backward to make excuses for his behavior. I've tried talking to her about it before, but she's so set in her ways. She sees it as her duty to protect him, no matter what." Hearing that only made me feel more hopeless. "So, what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Just keep quiet and let it keep happening?" "Not necessarily," my aunt replied. "You can't change your mom, but you can set boundaries for yourself. Focus on what you need to do to get out of there, even if it means making some sacrifices. It's not fair, but sometimes that's the only way." Her words stuck with me for the rest of the day. I hated the idea of giving up on my mom and brother, but maybe she was right. Maybe the only way to preserve my sanity was to start focusing on my own future, even if it felt selfish. That evening, I sat down with my budget and started crunching numbers. Moving out still felt like a distant dream, but I was determined to make it happen. I began looking into second jobs, side hustles, anything that could help me save up faster. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, things at home continued to deteriorate. My mom's loan had come through, and my brother was already making plans to spend it on equipment for his startup. When I asked if he'd at least put together a business plan, he laughed and said, "I don't need one. I've got it all figured out in my head." The sheer arrogance of it left me speechless. A week later, I came home to find a stack of packages in the hallway. My brother had ordered everything from high-end electronics to custom merchandise with his logo on it. My mom was in the kitchen, looking worried as she went through the receipts. "Are you sure all of this is necessary?" she asked him when he came in. He rolled his eyes. "Mom, this is an investment. You have to spend money to make money." I couldn't hold back any longer. "An investment? Are you serious? You don't even have a plan." My brother glared at me. "Stay out of it. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you're dragging Mom into debt for one of your half-baked ideas," I shot back. My mom tried to mediate, but her voice was drowned out by our shouting. The argument ended with my brother storming out and me retreating to my room, fuming. Later that night, my mom knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked hesitantly. I let her in, but I was still too angry to say much. She sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "I'm trying my best," she said. "I just want both of you to be happy." "But what about you, Mom?" I asked. "When do you get to be happy?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and took my hand. "I know I've made mistakes," she said softly, "but he's my son, and I can't just give up on him. I'll figure it out somehow." Her words broke my heart because I could see how much she believed them, even if they weren't true. I wanted to shake her, to make her see that she wasn't helping him by enabling him, but I also knew it wouldn't make a difference. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. I threw myself into work and planning my escape, while my brother continued to live in his fantasy world. My mom tried to keep the peace, but it was clear she was struggling to hold everything together. The cracks in our family were widening, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep pretending they didn't exist. Despite everything, there were moments when I caught glimpses of the family we used to be. Like the time my mom insisted we all sit down for dinner together, even though none of us were in the mood. Or the night my brother came into my room to borrow something and ended up reminiscing about our childhood for an hour. Those moments reminded me that, underneath all the resentment and frustration, there was still love. It just wasn't enough to fix what was broken. As the weeks went on, I started to notice small changes in my mom. She seemed more tired, more distracted. I worried that the stress was taking a toll on her health, but she brushed off my concerns. "I'm fine," she'd say, forcing a smile. But I knew she wasn't. One night, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills. She didn't hear me come in, so I stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked so small, so vulnerable. It hit me then that she was just as trapped as I was, maybe even more so. And for the first time, I felt a pang of sympathy for her that overshadowed my anger. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm still working on saving up to move out, but part of me feels guilty for leaving her behind. At the same time, I know I can't keep living like this. Something has to give, but I'm not sure what it will be. All I know is that this story isn't over yet. As weeks turned into months, the tension in the house began to feel like an almost physical presence. Every interaction with my mom and brother carried an undercurrent of unresolved conflict. My brother continued to throw himself into his business, which seemed to consist mostly of brainstorming sessions with his friends that led nowhere. The living room had become his workspace, with papers, gadgets, and empty takeout containers strewn everywhere. It was a constant reminder of how little he contributed and how much he took. My mom, for her part, seemed caught between trying to support him and trying to keep the peace. She'd alternate between encouraging his dreams and worrying aloud about the financial strain. Occasionally, I'd catch her staring off into space, her face etched with lines of stress I hadn't noticed before. It was clear she was overwhelmed, but she refused to admit it, brushing off any attempt I made to talk about it. One evening, after another particularly frustrating day at work, I came home to find my brother's friends sprawled out in the living room. They were laughing loudly, eating snacks my mom had bought, and discussing some new concept for the business. My brother was at the center of it all, acting like the charismatic leader of a team destined for greatness. It was infuriating. Without saying a word, I went to my room and slammed the door. A few minutes later, there was a knock. I opened it to find my mom standing there, looking hesitant. "What?" I snapped, regretting my tone as soon as the word left my mouth. She sighed. "I know it's frustrating for you, but they're trying." "He's trying. Is he?" I shot back. "Because all I see is him using you to fund his hobbies while the rest of us have to be adults." Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might finally agree with me. But then she said, "He just needs more time. You know how hard it's been for him." That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Hard for him? Mom, it's been hard for all of us. But you don't see me sitting around waiting for someone to fix my life. You're enabling him, and it's not helping him grow up. It's just making things worse for everyone." She looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm doing the best I can," she said softly. "You'll understand one day when you're a parent." That line felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to yell, to tell her that understanding wasn't the issue, that enabling someone's bad behavior wasn't love. But instead, I just closed the door. I couldn't deal with it anymore. The following weekend, I decided to take my aunt's advice and focus on my own future. I started looking for apartments in earnest, even though I knew it would mean taking on a second job. I began researching part-time gigs that I could do on evenings or weekends. It wasn't ideal, but the thought of having my own space, free from the constant drama, was enough to motivate me. As I was scrolling through listings one night, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. It was unusual for him to message me, so I opened it with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Hey, can we talk?" it read. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but another part, the part that still remembered the bond we'd had as kids, decided to give him a chance. "Sure," I replied. "When? Now?" he texted back. I took a deep breath and went to his room. He was sitting on the bed, looking uncharacteristically serious. For a moment, I thought he might actually be ready to take responsibility for his actions. But his first words dashed that hope. "Mom's been really stressed lately," he said. "I think you should try to be more supportive." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Me? Are you kidding? I'm not the one adding to her stress. That would be you. He frowned. "Look, I know things haven't been perfect, but I'm doing my best. I just need you to back off and give me some space to figure things out." "Your best?" I said, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Your best is letting Mom take out a loan so you can play entrepreneur while the rest of us deal with reality." He stood up, his face flushing with anger. "You think it's so easy? You think I don't feel the pressure? I'm trying to make something of myself, and all you do is tear me down." "Because you're not making anything of yourself," I shot back. "You're taking advantage of Mom, and it's not fair to her or to me." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. Then he said, "You don't understand what it's like to fail. You've always had it together. You've never had to struggle." That broke me. "Never had to struggle? Are you serious? I've been working since I was 16. I put myself through school and I'm still paying off loans. Don't you dare tell me I don't know what it's like to struggle." He didn't respond, and I realized there was no point in continuing the argument. I turned and left, slamming the door behind me. That night, I lay awake thinking about his words. Did he really believe I'd had it easy? Or was that just an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for his own life? Either way, it didn't change the fact that something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, and I couldn't keep waiting for things to magically get better. The next morning, I called a few landlords to set up apartment viewings. I didn't know how I was going to afford it yet, but I knew I had to try. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, not for my family, but for myself. And that would have to be enough for now. The day I finally moved out felt surreal. After months of searching, budgeting, and working extra hours, I had found a small, affordable apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, just a studio with creaky floors and a faint smell of paint, but it was mine. Standing in the empty space, surrounded by boxes, I felt a strange mix of liberation and guilt. Leaving my mom behind had been one of the hardest decisions of my life. The morning I packed my things, she stood in the doorway, trying to keep a brave face. "You know you're always welcome here," she said, her voice trembling. "I know, Mom," I replied, hugging her tightly. "But I need to do this. For me." My brother didn't even come downstairs to say goodbye. I wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen to him and to her without me there to intervene. But I reminded myself that they were adults, and it wasn't my job to fix their lives. I had spent too long carrying a weight that wasn't mine to bear. The first few weeks in my new place were a whirlwind of adjustment. I reveled in the freedom of having my own space, where every decision from the decor to the groceries was entirely mine. At the same time, I felt a persistent ache of loneliness. I missed my mom's presence, even with all the tension. And though I hated to admit it, I even missed my brother in some small, complicated way. But the distance gave me clarity. For the first time, I was able to see my family dynamics from the outside. I realized how deeply ingrained my mom's patterns of enabling were, not just with my brother, but with me too. She had always been the fixer, the caregiver, the one who absorbed everyone else's burdens. And while her intentions came from a place of love, they had created a cycle that none of us knew how to break. I began calling her once a week, trying to rebuild our relationship from a healthier distance. At first, our conversations were stilted, filled with awkward silences and forced small talk. But over time, they became more genuine. She started opening up about her own struggles, admitting how overwhelmed she felt, but also how trapped she was by her sense of responsibility. "I know I've made mistakes," she said one evening, her voice heavy with regret. "I just wanted to protect you both. I thought I was doing the right thing." "I know, Mom," I replied gently. "But you don't have to do it all alone. It's okay to let him face the consequences of his choices. It's the only way he'll learn." She didn't respond right away, but I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "I'll try," she said finally. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. As for my brother, things came to a head a few months after I moved out. His startup had predictably failed, leaving him with a pile of debt and no plan for how to pay it off. When he asked my mom for more money, she hesitated for the first time. "I can't keep bailing you out," she told him, her voice firm but sad. "You need to figure this out on your own." He didn't take it well. For days, the house was filled with the sound of his anger, slamming doors, raised voices, bitter accusations. But my mom held her ground, and eventually he stopped asking. He started looking for a job, reluctantly at first, but with more determination as the weeks went by. It wasn't much, just a retail position at a local electronics store, but it was a step forward. Watching from a distance, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. Maybe he would finally start to take responsibility for his life. Or maybe not. Either way, it wasn't my battle to fight anymore. In the months that followed, I focused on building a life for myself. I picked up a new hobby, painting, and joined a local community center where I met people who shared my interests. I started therapy, working through the years of resentment and guilt that had weighed me down. It was a slow process, but it felt like progress. My relationship with my mom continued to improve, little by little. She even visited my apartment once, bringing a casserole and fussing over how charming the place was. It reminded me of the best parts of her warmth, her generosity, her endless capacity for love. I knew we'd never fully agree on everything, but for the first time, it felt like we were starting to understand each other. As for my brother, I kept my distance. We'd exchange polite hellos during family gatherings, but that was the extent of our interaction. It wasn't ideal, but it was what I needed to protect my peace. I hope that, someday, we might find a way to reconnect. But for now, I was content to let time and space do their work. Looking back, I realized that leaving hadn't been an act of abandonment. It had been an act of self-preservation, of breaking free from a cycle that had held us all captive for too long. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't fix everything, but it gave me the chance to breathe, to grow, to find myself again. And maybe, just maybe, it gave my family the chance to do the same.